Hello everyone. Hello everyone. Welcome to this audio podcast. This audio podcast as part of the Squeal and Squark. This audio podcast as part of the Hannah Squad. This audio podcast as part of the Ship Mode Unit, and this audio podcast as part of a ZtormLabostix production. In through this audio podcast, and on through this audio podcast, um, looking at sort of a response really to another question in as part of this series, and the question being what first drew you to the laboratory, and what makes you proud to put on your lab coat every day. So in around this particular question, it's quite an intriguing question because there's not actually any one particular sort of a particular aspect that actually that drew me into being involved and having sort of a basis in and around laboratory workings, and sort of blood sciences. Um, and I suppose one of the first things was that as per the initial audio podcast, where I talked about where there was a response in regard to, could you tell us a bit about your background, for example. um, one of the main things that sort of got me intrigued into the in around blood science and laboratory workings, and sort of and or pathology, had really been actually in looking at in having an early intrigue in around the different etiology of different kinds of conditions, different kinds of conditions around um, around um, around around human pathophysiology. I always had an intrigue in in mainly in hematology, but then expanded sort of my intrigue further into immunobiology, and since there are sort of quite a few healthcare conditions in hematology that actually additionally have sort of an immunological or immunobiological basis. I actually got intrigued in looking at sort of how different sort of conditions and aspects of healthcare could be could be could be bettered for different kinds of healthcare service users, patients and or recipients. There was in my earlier in some of my earlier works, I actually developed some writings that actually were in around solid organ transplantation, but also in around different healthcare conditions, such as for example myasthenia gravis, Huntington's disease, and in around Crowson syndrome, and the different kinds of these different sorts of conditions that patients or recipients can have, and sort of going through different sort of literature. For example, I was very inquisitive in my workings in blood sciences. So I always had this sort of this mindset where I would question different aspects of and in around the different specimens that would come through the laboratory. So, for example, if there would be a healthcare professional, frontline healthcare professional, clinician, for example, that would question in around a particular sort of symptom or symptomology and around particular patients that they may have. I was one of those. Sort of healthcare professionals in blood sciences that once a specimen came through, that I would question sort of in around the different kinds of symptomologies that the clinicians or physicians would query in addition to the specimen that they've sent through or they send through the laboratory. So I was I was very very early on. So even going back to the time of when I was in secondary school, there was a time where I was actually there was a time, I think it was when there was when there was a time when we had back in secondary school, we had a duration where students had opportunity to have work experience, organized work experience. And I organized my work experience actually in pathology, and where I was fortunate enough to organize organize time within a pathology department within one of the local pathology departments in one of the hospitals, and I got to rotate in different parts of the pathology department, and one of my most intriguing experiences of that sort of back in the day was actually looking at kind of the specimens that clinicians and physicians, for example, query in around, for example, particular tests or investigations or testing investigation requests aligned to microbiology or bacteriology. And I remember streaking agar plates to actually identify different kinds of microorganisms to determine or identify particular infections, for example. So that was back in during my time when I had some work experience in secondary school. But then I got more intrigued in around that, and actually in around that, and so from a very early on, I was quite inquisitive. I had always been quite inquisitive in around querying and questioning sort of different aspects in around pathophysiology, and sort of looking at different kinds of sort of the basis of particular illnesses. So I got quite immersed in that sort of in around that in that sort of world quite early on, and I then actually it was in around my undergrad, sorry, in my college years, late college years, and going into my undergrad, I actually became more interested and more intrigued in around as mentioned in around hematology, transfusion, and immunobiology, and I was one of those individuals that didn't actually have exposure to the laboratory till quite later on. It was mainly because I also had an intrigue in around research, or sort of in line to sort of academic works, and particularly I had that sort of mindset where alongside sort of investigators, I had a sort of a mindset where I would want to develop works with colleagues and collaborators, sort of quite early on, to actually to actually contribute to different sort of workings in around blood sciences and pathology. So I was one of those sort of individuals, sort of linking sort of aspects of the sciences, sort of human sciences, if you will, in and around humans, in around aspects of human sciences and in around illnesses and diseases. But then it was when my first sort of exposure into hematology in particular was when I was actually doing my trainee sort of post some years ago now, and I actually did my trainee post in mainly in hematology, and there was aspects there was a sort of a rotation in a link, a sort of rotation between hematology and transfusion. And back then, it was quite intriguing because healthcare professionals from the sciences also had opportunities or had sort of as part of their works where they would actually go to particular hematology clinics, and they would actually be involved in, for example, in around doing in around in around the sort of where they were involved in clinical sort of a sort of a I'd say sort of a soft clinical sort of position where they actually had a thing where they were doing clinics for those with clotting challenges. So those who were on, for example, on blood thinners, and so healthcare professionals from the sciences were actually involved in what's referred to as point of care testing, or POCT, or NPT, near patient testing, for those who were on blood thinners. And so they were taking specimens and also sort of analyzing those specimens to ensure that patients would have the applicable dosages in around their blood thinners, for example. But in hematology generally, from the laboratory side of things, we were doing, I was very intrigued by looking at things like sort of investigations around hemoglobinopathies, and clotting investigations, blood clotting investigations, and also in around where clinicians would question in around, for example, where there would be an abnormal sort of a full blood count, or an abnormal red blood cell count, or an abnormal reticulocyte count, or an abnormal white cell count, for example. And so my the sort of the early learnings I had in around some of the investigations in around hematology it got me sort of intrigued in around asking important questions around what a patient or recipient who a clinician was, a clinician would be requesting requesting blood investigations on behalf of, and the kind of like what they would potentially be going through. So from the sciences, we're not from the sciences, healthcare professionals in the sciences are not really sort of in more in the way healthcare services are nowadays, are not really sort of patient facing healthcare professionals, unfortunately, in the majority of of aspects around healthcare services. But it was actually where it was having where as a healthcare professional from that side of things, I had this inquisitive mindset where I was thinking like I was thinking what a patient might have to go through, or what they would have to deal with when they have particular investigations, blood investigations. and so that made me actually quite, I guess, quite. Apart from being inquisitive, it made me quite intrigued in sort of actually developing sort of early writings as well, alongside my sort of the practical elements of blood sciences, and then it was where I started where I would write a question down. I would write a question down and basically look to follow up on that particular question that I would have, and then basically look to develop sort of early writings around that. And that's where sort of my sort of the academic side kind of came in, and that was sort of early on. Um, uh, and and apart from hemoglobinopathies, so for example, sickle cell anemia and thalassemia, for example, and particular conditions aligned to those who might be in sort of, for example, minority populations and marginalized populations, how certain patient cohorts, for example, are more susceptible to particular illnesses or conditions. And so apart from the workings in around the early understanding and around hemoglobinopathies and around clotting investigations, for example, there were investigations that, for example, were particular to pediatrics and young people, for example, as well. So those who were diagnosed with or suspect for example, conditions such as hemolytic uremic syndrome, or Henoch-Schönlein purpura, for example, or for example, ITP, for example, idiopathic thrombocytic purpura, um, and so there was, ITP being idiopathic thrombocytopenia, and there were then, patients who would have, conditions or suspect for other conditions in context of transfusion and transfusion practices, those patients who were basically would have particular cancers, particular kinds of cancers or leukemias, where their healthcare provision would potentially would have a basis of relying on in around blood transfusion. And then there were, particular investigations that were happening in transfusion practices, where we basically were looking at particular antibodies and serology, for example. So I got quite intrigued in a lot of it, in quite a bit of in quite a bit of hematology and transfusion early on. But then it was through the through early learnings that I started, sort of developing sort of my intrigues in around questioning, how can, healthcare services, or how can the sciences, or how can sort of pathology or blood sciences be better sort of could be better for patients or healthcare service users, and in such a way that healthcare professionals generally, as well as the public, sort of get a sort of get a sort of an understanding of how the sciences are behind the sort of behind the sort of the sort of inner workings of healthcare and healthcare services. So that's what drew me into a laboratory workings early on, and and that also at the same time made me quite proud. It actually made me quite proud of having that sort of intrigue, or those sorts of intrigues, because where clinicians they have the basis where they see the patients, and they get to see and get to communicate and get an understanding with patients. In the sciences, much of it is done blindly. We don't see patients, we don't see recipients actually, unfortunately, going through the sort of symptomologies and what they're challenged with. We don't get to communicate with them, but equally, that doesn't make healthcare professionals in the sciences less empathetic or less sympathetic with healthcare service users, because as soon as a specimen comes through, basically the sciences is basically a workforce that actually are much like basically like a workforce that that generally sort of works in line to much like a well-oiled machine, basically, to ensure that patient and healthcare service users get the best out of their healthcare. And that is just that's on the basis of just having, for example, sort of simple details that are put forward with put forward with particular patient specimens. And patient specimens come in various forms as well. Apart from blood, there's also it can be urine, can be feces, can be sort of wound specimens, can be nasal specimens, can be all kinds of specimens that come through the laboratory. And it actually made me first and foremost, I was quite timid, trying to sort of get a grasp with the different kinds of specimens that would come through. But that actually then is where I actually became more proud of actually having the lab coat on, and actually being part of a workforce, or being part of a professional body that actually tailors its practice towards practice best practices, and actually also at the same time where every every scientist generally works towards best practices. But then the idea is actually ensuring that best practices are evident, are sort of evidence and form evidence, that new evidence is formed and around particular healthcare conditions. And thus the way of healthcare professionals in the sciences is where we have that opportunity, or that way to actually prompt practice excellence, to ensure that our frontline healthcare professionals, for example, that the way that they deliver aspects of their investigations for patients and patients and healthcare service users, for example, in context of the public domain, that they use the best evidence made available. So from the laboratory and wearing a lab coat, which is something I've always been proud of, and having that sort of camaraderie with colleagues, generally and retrospectively, I actually have then become more aligned to developing my sort of practices, sort of my practical understandings, in line to different sort of divisions of pathology or blood sciences, so that healthcare, so that the public and healthcare professional colleagues and collaborators, for example, that they can learn from works, and learn from and around new evidence. And so my workings have been a link between laboratory practices and aspects of academia. So So that's made me generally quite proud of being able to be quite proud of having a lab coat, or having the lab coat on, and basically having that time to actually appreciate the workings in around different laboratory settings, and sort of where such healthcare professionals have have and do develop sort of more interlinks between frontline healthcare practices, and sort of the laboratory settings, laboratory environments, that patients and healthcare service users know that they are and will get the best out of their healthcare. So that's basically my sort of my sort of my sort of additional sort of my additional sort of understandings in around this, but also my sort of efforts, and what makes me sort of proud to be part of that healthcare workforce. And at the same time, it has been sort of an intriguing link, because in healthcare laboratories, sort of generally speaking, there's whilst there are healthcare professionals who develop, workings in around developing new evidence, and evidence in around different aspects of laboratory practices, but also in line to in around different aspects of healthcare conditions. So there are various professional bodies that are part of, for example, hematology, and part of transfusion laboratories, and part of biochemistry laboratories, immunology laboratories, etc. Um, but it is where most of the efforts in around the healthcare professionals that sort of contribute to sort of the developing of new evidence in around particular healthcare conditions. That's normally done for in around more senior grades. And I've always been sort of an advocate to actually ensure that students, as well as sort of early learning scientists, for example, trainee scientists, as well as students, for example, at undergrad, and early postgrad, for example, that they have opportunities. So I've been a sort of an advocate in that way, and having the laboratory coat on, it just it's made me generally, again, sort of quite proud to be involved in and immersed in that world. So thank you for tuning in on this audio podcast. This audio podcast has been part of the Squeal and Squark. This audio podcast is part of the Hala Squad. This audio podcast is part of the Shit Mode Unit, and this audio podcast as part of a ZtormLabostix production.